Good day, everybody. This is our second presentation on the central nervous system. The first one dealt with the brain and its structures, and in this one we're going to extend how the brain branches down and is joined to the spinal cord, the second part of the central nervous system. In actual development, it's the spinal cord that develops first, and the brain develops as a bulge on top of that. So we've kind of reversed the process, talking about this starting with the brain. Now we're going to explore what's going on with the spinal cord itself. Now, the spinal cord, extends from the medulla oblongata, so just as it opens up at the base of the foramen magnum, base of the skull, it's going to extend all the way down to the first or second lumbar vertebra. Now, the spinal cord is divided into three distinct regions, as you see here. The top part is the cervical region. Second part down inferiorly is the thoracic region. And the final portion down here, the lumbar region. Now you can also include down in here, although most textbooks don't, the sacral region. This is more just kind of like a branching of the nerve fibers going out, supplying nerves to the pelvic region and your lower organs. This part that looks like a horse's tail is called the cauda equina, Latin for horse's tail. It's important to remember that the spinal cord serves as an information pathway, information going both directions. Motor messages going out from the brain to all the body parts, and sensory messages going in from the body regions into the brain, into the spinal cord, into the brain. Off the spinal cord, you'll find 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which we'll talk about in later discussions when we start talking about the peripheral nervous system. So the spinal cord is itself approximately 18 inches long, about an inch in diameter. So you can figure that the diameter of your spinal cord itself is about the size of your thumb. Now, it's well protected within the vertebral column, so there's not much risk of harm in there, unless, of course, as we discussed with the skeletal system, something happens to one of those intervertebral discs that gets ruptured or herniated and applies pressure to the spinal cord, and then it's just like any other limb going to sleep. You're going to have lack of sensation and lack of motor control below that part. Now, while it's pretty much uniform, about an inch in diameter, there are two regions where it does form an enlargement, in the cervical region and in the lumbar region. This makes perfect sense if you remember that it's in those regions that the axons, and again we'll discuss more about axons when we start actually looking at the nerves themselves. So it might be best just to think of these as just nerves that branch out, controlling the neck and upper arms. They're in the cervical region, so you've got an obvious need for an enlargement of that region. And the same thing in the lumbar region. Now, another prominent structure of the spinal cord I'd like to point out to you is this region right down here, where the spinal cord actually ends. The spinal cord ending right here around L1, L2 ends in something called the conus medullaris. It's the end of a part, and like I mentioned earlier, the horse's tail that erupts from that, just a collection of nerve fibers that branch on out. Now, another way the spinal cord is similar to the brain is in this protective coat called the meninges. The meninges extend around the outside of the spinal cord, and again house the cerebral spinal fluid, just like around the brain. Now, as you can guess here, since the spinal cord itself ends around L1 or L2, it would be safe to do a spinal tap below that level, so usually around L3, L4. Doctors will insert a needle between the intervertebral discs and puncture into this sac that carries the cerebral spinal fluid protecting the spinal cord. And from here they can draw out fluid to analyze to look for diseases such as meningitis. Now, the spinal cord, if you look at this cross-sectional picture here, see several prominent structures. And the one we want to focus on this slide is the outer portion, right through here, all this white matter. Now, the white matter on the spinal cord is on the outside of the cord, whereas in the brain it's on the inside. If you remember our study of the cerebral cortex in the last lecture, the gray matter is on the outside, only maybe a couple of millimeters thick. And here, the gray matter is on the inside, bigger portion. Now, like I put on the slide here, the exterior white matter are basically conduction tracts. What that means is they are going to carry messages from the brain to the muscles or organs and glands, or they're going to carry sensory messages to the brain. Now, ascending tracts are basically going to be sensory in nature, and they are generally going to be found on the posterior columns, like right through here. They'll also be found on the edges and on the front, kind of in the areas right around here, right around the edges, and here. Remember, those are going to be sensory. They're carrying messages about their environment to the brain. Now, descending tracts, basically every place else. So you're looking for descending tracts going right along the inside here, round and through here, and around on the inside here. These descending tracts, being motor, they're going to carry messages, impulses here to signal for voluntary motions. So these will be the fiber tracts that you'll be running along that are carrying information about, hey, it's time to close your fist, grab the doorknob, rotate the doorknob counterclockwise, unlock the door, things like that. Now the fibers are white because they're coated with a white fatty material called myelin, M-Y-L-E-N. Myelin sheaths make the fibers white, and they also improve nerve conduction. We'll spend more time with that when we actually spend time talking about the nerves themselves. Now, the gray matter, which has the appearance that you see here, kind of like a butterfly, to me it looks like a butterfly, or the letter H, is mostly cell bodies. So within here you're going to actually find the unmyelinated actual cell bodies. Now the posterior horns, these would be the ones right back here. The posterior horns are going to be basically receiving sensory signals. So the cell bodies located in these posterior horns, again right here, are going to be receiving sensory information from the sensory nerves. While those in the anterior horns, ventral horns down in here, are basically going to be neurons that's where these neurons here for motor nerves. The cell bodies that are going to control your motor functions. All right, so what basically happens is this. If, for example, you had a pinprick, you pricked your finger, that signal would come in right through here and it'd go to these the nerve cells in here. This is basically the integration center in a reflex arc. Now, if you've pricked your finger, the sensation is going to be transferred to one of these other ascending tracts. Again, the ones for your fingers are going to come in through here and go to these ascending tracts along here and go up your spinal cord. At the same time, that sensory information in a reflex arc is going to come over here through interneurons or association neurons, and synapse or join with, synapses doesn't really mean join, but probably at this point the closest analogy we got, they join with the motor neurons here, and those nerve signals then pass out the spinal cord and up this ventral horn, this ventral root. That leads me to two other structures here that I should mention as part of the spinal cord. Is this one up here, the dorsal root ganglion. Ganglions are collections of nerve cell bodies located outside the central nervous system. This is the dorsal root, and this one contains all the sensory neurons, the actual cell bodies of the sensory nerves, in this spot. So they're going to have very long structures called dendrites going out this way, and much shorter axons carrying the impulses to the spinal cord. At the same time, you're going to have motor neurons here. Their dendrites and motor cell bodies are going to be located within this gray matter, and their axons, or sending bodies, are going to go out through this lower structure here called the ventral root. Dorsal root on the back side, ventral root on the front side. Always remember that at the center of this H, if you want to view the gray matter as an H, or right where the butterfly's body would be, you have a structure called the central canal. The central canal is, I put up here the notes, filled with cerebral spinal fluid. This is the way the cerebral spinal fluid is transferred, through the spinal cord, back and forth through the ventricles where it's formed. As a matter of fact, the cerebral spinal fluid in the central canal originates there in the fourth ventricle and goes straight on down into the central canal. So the central canal actually originates from the fourth ventricle of the brain. And again, its main function is to provide a cushion, in the subarachnoid space. Again, that area right between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, subarachnoid, under the arachnoid. But that fluid actually forms a little cushion in there. And in lab experiences, I've got a few models here to kind of show you how this would work. Make sure you take some time to look in the lab and see how those structures are set up. Now, remember, and I've mentioned this several times in this lecture already, the meninges do cover the spinal cord just like they cover the brain. And they're composed of the same regions. The innermost region that hugs right next to the spinal cord is called the pia mater. Surrounding that is the arachnoid matter, which again gets its name from the cobweb or spiderweb type appearance, and the dura mater on the outside. Now, off the spinal cord, you're going to have nerves, leaving at the level of each vertebrae. In the vertebrae, they are going to leave between that intervertebral space. That you saw when we studied the bones here, how the vertebrae fit together, and if you look between the vertebrae, there's going to be a little opening, and the nerves will leave through there. Now, some of the big things to make sure that you understand is, remember, and I've already mentioned this in the previous slide, the dorsal root. That's the part that comes into the spinal cord from the back side. Most important thing to remember about this is that this is going to be carrying afferent fibers. Afferent, the prefix affer, A-F-F-E-R, always means toward the main structure. So afferent fibers are going towards the spinal cord. And in particular, in the dorsal root, always remember about that dorsal root ganglion. Ganglions are cell bodies located outside the central nervous system. Now, I mentioned the dorsal root ganglion with the spinal cord because they're so close together. The dorsal root ganglion, that's where all the cell bodies for your sensory neurons, not the special senses by any means, but sensory neurons for touch, pressure, pain, they're all located right there. So it'd be easy to imagine that if anything happened to that dorsal root ganglion, leading to the spinal cord, that area of the body that is going to be supplied with those sensory nerves is going to be, lose all sensation. All right. Now the ventral root, that's on the front side. The ventral root always carries motor neurons, or as we call them, efferent fibers. That's E-F-F-E-R-E-N-T. The prefix effer, E-F-F-E-R, always means away from. So efferent fibers are carrying nerve impulses away from the spinal cord. So these are going to be basically going to effectors, E-F-F-E-C-T-O-R-S. Effectors are either going to be muscles or glands. And those muscles don't have to be skeletal muscles. They can also be muscles going to different internal organs.